He had ridden past 100 broken fences in his life and never once looked back. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the woman on her knees in the mud, wrestling a fence post back into frozen ground with bare, bleeding hands. Maybe it was the way she didn't look up when he slowed his horse, didn't call out, didn't beg, just kept working like the world owed her nothing, and she'd stopped expecting it to. Elias Mercer almost rode on. He told himself he would. He didn't. And that one moment, that single, unremarkable pause on a dirt trail in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, would become the beginning of everything neither of them ever dared to want again. If this kind of story moves you, the kind built from real dirt and real heartbreak and people who refuse to quit, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The wind off the Laramie foothills didn't ask permission before it hit you. It came low and hard and mean, carrying the smell of pine resin and coming snow, cutting right through whatever you were wearing like it had somewhere to be and you were just in the way. By mid-October, most ranchers in this part of Wyoming had already laid in their winter stores, patched their roofs, and were watching the sky with the resigned expression of people who understood that the land didn't negotiate. Elias Mercer had been riding for 11 days straight. He wasn't running from anything. Not exactly. That was what he told himself anyway. He was simply moving, the way he'd been moving for the better part of 18 years, following whatever road lay ahead because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. And remembering was a luxury a man like him couldn't afford. He was 44 years old and looked 50. Not because life had been cruel in any unusual way, but because he'd lived most of it outside, in weather exactly like this, doing work that used a man up and put nothing back. His hands were the color of old saddle leather and had the same texture. There were 3 parallel scars across the left one from a barbed wire incident in Colorado that he never talked about. His face had the kind of lines that came not just from sun and wind, but from years of keeping expressions locked down tight, of training yourself not to let anything show. He rode a roan gelding named Duff that he'd bought off a dying horse trader in Cheyenne for $6 and a blanket. Duff was ugly and temperamental and bit strangers, but he had good feet and could go all day without complaint, which made him, in Elias's estimation, better company than most people. The trail he was following wasn't much of a trail at all. More of a suggestion, really, 2 wheel ruts pressed into rocky soil that wound down from the foothills toward the basin below. There were ranches scattered across this country, most of them small operations barely clinging to existence. And Elias had spent the past 2 weeks drifting from one to the next, asking about work, moving on when there wasn't any, which was most of the time. The cattle industry was having a rough season. Everyone seemed to be cutting back. He wasn't worried. He'd been broke before. He'd figure something out. He always did. The Holloway place announced itself not with a sign or a gate, but with the smell. The sharp, particular smell of livestock that haven't been properly tended, of hay that's gone too long without being turned, of wood rot that's gotten into things it shouldn't. Elias had spent enough years around ranch operations to read that smell the way other men read newspapers. It told him a story before he'd even rounded the bend in the trail. The story it told was, someone is losing here. He came around the tree line and saw the homestead below, a low-slung house with a sagging porch, a barn that was listing slightly to the northeast like a drunk man trying to walk straight, a series of paddocks enclosed by fencing that had seen better decades. In one of the paddocks, 3 horses stood with their heads down, not quite dejected, but not exactly thriving either. A milk cow was tied near the barn door, watching the middle distance with the philosophical patience of an animal that has accepted its circumstances. And there, at the corner of the nearest fence, a woman. She was on her knees in the half-frozen mud, both hands wrapped around a fence post that had worked itself loose from the ground, trying to shove it back into a hole that clearly wasn't cooperating. She was wearing a heavy canvas coat, a man's hat with the brim pulled low against the wind, and work gloves with the fingers cut off. And still he could see, even from this distance, that her hands were red with cold. She did not look up. Elias slowed Duff to a walk without quite deciding to. He studied the place as he came down the trail. The fence she was fighting with wasn't the only problem. He could see 2 other sections that had collapsed completely, just lying flat on the cold ground like they'd given up. The barn door was hanging by one hinge. There was a pile of firewood near the house that wasn't going to last 6 weeks in this climate, let alone a full Wyoming winter. The vegetable garden against the south wall of the house was brown and dead, which was normal for October, but someone hadn't pulled the frost-killed plants yet, and they'd gone to a kind of wet black mush that would make spring planting harder. The woman was still wrestling with the fence post when Duff clopped close enough that she finally looked up. Her face was not what he expected. He didn't know what he'd expected exactly. Someone broken, maybe. Someone with the look of a person who'd already surrendered even if the body hadn't gotten the message yet. But that wasn't what he saw. What he saw was fury. Not the hot explosive kind. The cold, controlled, endless kind. The fury of someone who has been fighting a losing battle so long that the fighting has become the whole point. Her jaw was set hard. Her eyes, dark brown, nearly black in the flat afternoon light, were the color of good topsoil and about as yielding. She was 39 years old, though he didn't know that yet, and the years had given her face a particular quality that he would spend a long time trying to name. It wasn't beauty exactly, though she wasn't far from it. It was more like conviction made physical, something hammered into the bone. She looked at him the way women on frontier homesteads always looked at strange men riding in off the trail. Assessment, calculation, a rapid, experienced inventory of threat level. Then she looked back at the fence post and shoved it into the ground with both hands. "Ma'am," Elias said. "Keep riding," she said. "Not unfriendly, just matter of fact. Looks like you've got some fence trouble." "I've noticed that myself." She sat back on her heels and examined the post, which was still not sitting right. "I don't need help." "Didn't offer any," Elias said. That made her look up again. He held up one hand, slow and non-threatening, the way you'd calm a horse that didn't know you yet. "Just making an observation. I'm a man passing through. You're a woman with a fence post. I'm not looking to be your hero." Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but a recalibration. "Then what are you looking for?" And here was the thing. Elias hadn't known the answer to that question until approximately 3 seconds ago. He'd been planning to ride on through to the next town, find a saloon with a bulletin board, see if anyone was hiring before the season closed out entirely. That had been the plan. But he looked at that fence line, and then at the barn door swinging in the wind, and then back at this woman kneeling in the mud with her red, raw hands, and something he couldn't quite name made him open his mouth and say, "Work. I'll work for shelter and meals. Nothing more. You put me up through the worst of winter. I'll earn my keep. When spring comes, I move on." A long silence. The wind moved through the bare cottonwood trees at the edge of the property and made a sound like something being mourned. "I don't know you," she said. "Margaret Holloway?" he said. He'd seen a name burned into the gatepost. Holloway, established 1874, half hidden by overgrown grass. Her eyes narrowed. "Where'd you hear that name?" "Your gate," he said. "I can read." Another silence, this one different. She was thinking. He could see it. The rapid, unsentimental calculation of a woman who had learned to make hard decisions alone and make them fast. "I don't take charity," she said finally. "It's not charity," Elias said. "I work, I eat, and sleep inside. That's a trade, Mrs. Holloway, not a gift. I can't pay you." "I didn't ask for pay." She stood up from the mud, and he noticed she did it without using her hands. Just unfolded herself from her knees to her feet in one controlled movement that spoke of a body accustomed to managing itself without assistance. She was taller than he'd expected, and she looked at him the way she might look at a piece of equipment she was considering purchasing, assessing its value, its wear, its likely lifespan. "What's your name?" she said. "Elias Mercer." "Where are you from, Elias Mercer?" "Mostly from the road," he said. "Before that, Illinois, long time ago." "You have references?" He almost smiled. "I've worked ranches in Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, and Montana. Before that, I did a year of carpentry in Denver and 2 years of blacksmith work in Abilene. I'm not pretty, and I'm not always easy to get along with, but I don't steal. I don't drink more than I should, and I work until the work is done." Margaret Holloway looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the fence post, still sitting crooked in the ground, mocking her, and then at the barn door swinging in the cold wind, and then back at him. "You'll sleep in the barn," she said. "I'll get you a cot and blankets. You cook your own breakfast. Dinner is at 6, not 1 minute later, and if you miss it, you don't eat until morning. You start tomorrow. I'll start now, Elias said. He climbed down from Duff and tied the horse to the fence rail. That barn door is going to damage itself further if the wind picks up tonight. And it will. She opened her mouth, closed it, watched him cross the yard toward the barn. Tool shed's around the back, she called after him. Left side. He raised one hand without turning around. He found out about the husband that first evening. Not from Margaret. She wasn't the kind of woman who volunteered personal information, as he'd figure out quickly enough. He found out from the small hand-carved cross mounted above the barn door, weather-worn and dry but maintained. Someone dusted it, occasionally re-oiled the wood. And from the photograph he spotted through the open kitchen window when he came around to check the east side of the house for rot. A studio photograph, formal and stiff the way they always were in that era. A man in his 30s with a broad face and cautious eyes, standing behind a seated Margaret who was younger in the picture but already had that same bone-deep particular quality in her expression. He didn't ask about it. After supper, boiled potatoes, salt pork, cornbread that was better than any cornbread he'd had in recent memory, she told him herself. Not the whole story, just the facts. My husband Thomas died 14 months ago, she said, not looking up from her coffee cup. Pneumonia. He was 41 years old, and he had never been sick a day in his life before that winter. And then he was dead in 8 days. She paused. I'm telling you so you know the situation, and not because I want sympathy. All right, Elias said. The ranch was his dream more than mine, originally, but it's mine now. She looked up. I'm not going to lose it. I can see that, Elias said. I've had people tell me I should sell, move to town, find another husband. Her voice was entirely level, with no particular heat in it, as if she were recounting facts about the weather rather than the string of insults people had apparently been offering her for over a year. I'm not interested in any of those options. All right, Elias said again. She seemed to find his lack of opinion either refreshing or suspicious. He couldn't quite tell which. She looked at him a moment longer and then stood and began clearing the dishes. The fence line on the north side is the worst, she said. 4 posts completely gone. I've been trying to get to it for 3 weeks, but there's always something more immediate. I'll look at it first thing, he said. And the barn roof? There's a section on the east side that's letting water in. It's been patched twice and keeps failing. What kind of roof? Board and batten, mostly, some shingle on the older section. He nodded. I'll need to know what materials you have on hand. There's lumber in the lean-to behind the tool shed. I don't know how much. Thomas kept better track of that than I did. There was a brief pause at the mention of his name. Just a small one. Then she kept moving, stacking plates at the basin, pouring water from the kettle. I'll inventory it tomorrow, Elias said. She made a sound that might have been agreement and might have been something else. He drained his coffee and went back out to the barn where his bedroll and cot were waiting and where Duff stood in a stall that was cleaner than expected. She'd been keeping up with the animals even while everything else fell apart, which told him something important about her sense of priority. He lay on the cot in the dark and listened to the wind work at the roof and thought, spring is a long way off. He'd been wrong to think the barn roof was the worst problem. The worst problem, he discovered over the following week, was the well. The Holloway homestead had 2 water sources, a creek that ran along the south boundary of the property and a hand-dug well about 40 feet from the house. The creek was fine in warmer months, but would either freeze or drop to a trickle come deep winter. The well, which should have been the reliable backup, had a crumbling stone lining, a rope that was more suggestion than fact, and a bucket that had at some point developed a split that someone had attempted to patch with pine pitch and hope. When Elias lowered the bucket on its 3rd morning and brought it up with maybe a third of the water it should have held, draining out through the split in a thin silver stream, he set the bucket down and stood there for a moment considering the situation. Margaret appeared at the house door. She watched him standing there, looking at the bucket. It's been like that a while, she said. There was a slight defensiveness in her voice that he was beginning to recognize as her version of embarrassment. She didn't blush, didn't fidget, just got that particular flatness in her tone that meant she was bracing for something. How long? He said. Since summer. I've been managing. With what? The creek, the rain barrel, melted snow when there's snow. Elias looked at the well and then at her. In a Wyoming winter, The creek's going to freeze solid for weeks at a time. Your rain barrel's going to be ice. You've got, what, 3 horses, a milk cow, and yourself that need water daily? I'm aware of my livestock situation, she said, with that bone-dry flatness that he was starting to think might actually be her version of humor. He didn't rise to it. I'm going to pull that bucket apart and rebuild it, and I'm going to reline the top section of that well while the ground's still soft enough to work it. I've done it before. With what materials? What stone do you have on the property? She thought for a moment. There's a section of creek bank on the east side where the water undercuts the limestone. Thomas was always pulling stones out of the field. Said they'd be useful someday. They're stacked behind the barn. Show me, Elias said. She showed him. It took most of that day to pull the right stones, another day to haul them to the well, and 3 days after that to do the actual relining. Cold, back-destroying work that required lying half inside the well shaft with a lamp and his arms over his head, fitting stones into a curve by feel as much as by sight. On the last evening of that work, he came inside for dinner, looking like something that had been dragged behind a horse. Margaret set his plate in front of him without comment, but when she refilled his coffee, she said quietly, "That would have been a bad winter without that fixed." "Yes," he said. "Thank you." He looked up. She was already turned away, back to the stove, and the word had been said with the particular careful control of someone who didn't deploy gratitude lightly and didn't want it to become a whole thing. He understood that. He felt the same way about receiving it. "It needed doing," he said. She nodded once, her back still to him, and that was the end of it. The days settled into a rhythm that surprised him, not because it was pleasant, exactly, but because it was functional, and he hadn't been part of anything functional in a very long time. He rose before light and saw to Duff and Margaret's horses. 3/4 horses that she'd named Hector, Nell, and the third one, a skittish bay mare, she called simply Mare, because she'd never gotten around to a proper name when Thomas was alive, and felt strange doing it alone afterward. He split wood and hauled water and patched fences and began the slow work of assessing every structure on the property for its winter worthiness. Margaret, meanwhile, was everywhere. She was one of those ranchers, and he'd known a few, who seemed to function on 3 hours of sleep and the sheer force of will not to let things slide. She was up before him some mornings, already out checking on the animals by the time he came to the barn. She knew every quirk of her land with an intimacy that he found quietly astonishing. She knew which field got waterlogged first. She knew that the north pasture had a particular grass that the horses went for in the fall and needed careful rotation. She knew that the old apple tree at the south end of the property was a reliable indicator of coming frost. When those last leaves dropped, you had maybe 4 days. She shared this knowledge without sentiment, in the practical informational tone of someone passing along useful facts. But sometimes he'd catch her standing at the edge of a field, looking at something only she could see, some mental map of what the place had been or could be. And there was a quality to her stillness in those moments that he didn't quite know what to do with. They didn't talk much. Not at first. At meals, he gave his daily accounting of what he'd done and what still needed doing, a foreman's report delivered to the only person in the room, and she listened and occasionally corrected his priorities or added information. Outside, they mostly worked in parallel, near enough to call if something was needed, but not so close that conversation was required. It was, he reflected, more comfortable than most human company he'd had. The first real argument came in November. He'd been on the property for just over 3 weeks. The barn roof was repaired. The well was solid. He'd rebuilt 4 sections of fencing and was making progress on the 5th. He'd found the source of the rot in the porch boards and replaced the worst of them, though the whole structure needed eventually to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. But that was a spring project. The argument was about the horses, specifically about Mary. He'd noticed that the mare was off her feed, not dramatically, not in a way that immediately alarmed, but a slight disinterest in grain that he'd seen before in horses that were heading toward something. He'd mentioned it to Margaret at dinner. She had stopped chewing and set down her fork. "She's been fine," Margaret said. "She's a little dull in the eye," he said. "I'm not saying she's sick, I'm saying she's worth watching." "I know my horses," Margaret said. "I'm sure you do. I've had those 3 horses for 6 years. I know when Nell is sore before she shows it. I know when Hector gets into a mood. I know Mare." Her jaw was set now, that familiar stubborn set. She's been adjusting to the colder weather. She always goes a little quiet this time of year. Has she always gone a little quiet this time of year, or is this quieter than usual? A pause. I'll keep an eye on her, Margaret said, with a finality that meant the subject was closed. He didn't push. It wasn't his place. 3 days later, at around 2 in the morning, a sound woke him. He lay on his cot in the barn and listened. Duff was awake. He could hear the restless shifting, and after another moment he heard it again, a low, distressed sound from Mare's stall. He was out of the cot before he'd fully decided to move. Mare was down. Not colicking badly, not in the first stages of a twist, but down and reluctant to rise, her sides slightly heaving, her eyes showing white at the edge. He got her up. It took 15 minutes of patient, steady work, and walked her slowly around the barn interior, talking to her in a low, continuous murmur, keeping her moving, checking her. She was warm. Her gut sounds were off. He was still walking her at 3:30 when the barn door opened. Margaret stood in the doorway in a coat thrown over her nightdress, a lantern in her hand. She took in the scene. Him in the circle of lantern light, still in his long underwear and work boots, walking Mare at a slow, steady pace. And something moved through her face that wasn't quite alarm and wasn't quite relief. She came in without a word and walked alongside him on Mare's other side, one hand on the horse's neck. How long? She said quietly. Heard her about 2, he said. She was down when I got here. Margaret made a sound low in her throat. Colic? Mild, I think. Her gut sounds are coming back. She's been passing some. He glanced at her across the horse's back. You should have let me know this happens to her. I didn't know, Margaret said, with a flatness that was different from her usual kind. This one had an edge of something she didn't want to let be seen. She's never done this before. They walked in silence for a while. She's going to be okay, he said, because he was fairly sure it was true, and because she needed to hear it. I know, Margaret said, which might or might not have been true, but he let her have it. They walked Mare for another hour and a half, trading off when one of them needed to rest their feet, talking quietly when they talked at all, mostly about the horse, what she'd eaten the past few days, the hay quality, the water, whether the change in weather might have contributed. By 5 in the morning, Mare was clearly improved, standing better, showing some interest in hay, her eye back to normal. Margaret leaned on the stall rail and watched her eat. The lantern light threw orange shadows across the barn and made everything look warmer than it was. I should have listened to you, she said, quietly, not looking at him. He was quiet for a moment. You were watching her. You would have caught it. Maybe not in time, but you might have. You know this horse. He didn't say it to be kind. He said it because it was probably true and because there was no point in rubbing her face in a mistake that hadn't actually turned out badly. She stood there with her arms on the stall rail and her jaw not quite as set as usual, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. A deeper tired, the kind that comes from 18 months of fighting alone and still not being sure you're going to win. How many animals have you lost? He asked. She looked at him, surprised by the question. Since Thomas, he clarified. How many have you lost? She thought. 2 chickens to a fox in January. One of Thomas's old workhorses in March. He was 22 and it was his time. That's all. In 18 months, alone, on a failing ranch in Wyoming, you've lost 2 chickens and a horse that was 22 years old. He held her gaze. You know what you're doing, Mrs. Holloway. Don't let one night make you forget that. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she looked back at Mare. Go to bed, she said. I'll sit with her for a while. He went. December arrived the way December always did in Wyoming, without apology. The first real snowfall came on the 3rd of the month, a solid 18 inches in under 30 hours, and by the time it stopped, the world had been reduced to a study in white and gray. Elias spent 2 days digging out, paths between the house and barn, the well cover, the woodpile, the outer gate. Margaret worked alongside him without being asked, and neither of them wasted breath on conversation. They just worked. There was something about that, he found himself thinking. Working next to someone in silence and not having it be uncomfortable. He'd spent the better part of 2 decades never quite comfortable in anyone's company for very long, always at the edge of his welcome, always aware that he was the hired man, not the member, always keeping one eye on the door. Here he was just a man shoveling snow, and she was just a woman shoveling snow next to him, and it wasn't complicated. That was probably dangerous. He was aware of that too. In the evenings, they sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and she began gradually to talk more. About the ranch, its history, its quirks, the things Thomas had built, and the things he'd planned to build and never gotten to. About the neighbors, some of whom she liked and most of whom she maintained a cautious distance from. About the land itself, which she talked about with a kind of territorial knowledge that went beyond property. She talked about the particular quality of the soil in the east field, about the way the wind came off the foothills and why certain spots on the property were sheltered while others were exposed, about the grass and what it told you about the water table below. He listened. Mostly he listened. He wasn't much of a talker by nature, and she wasn't asking him to be. She seemed to simply need someone there while she talked, which was different from the loneliness she'd had before, which had been talking into a silence that didn't talk back. Sometimes he offered observations about fence line management or livestock rotation or things he'd seen work on other ranches. She listened to these with the focused attention of someone building a mental catalog, asking precise follow-up questions, occasionally pushing back on something she disagreed with, which he found he didn't mind. She was usually right about the things she pushed back on. "How do you know so much about horses?" she asked one evening. They were sitting with coffee going cold in the cold kitchen, the wind doing its work outside, snow tapping at the window. "Spent 3 years on a horse ranch in Nebraska," he said. "Man named Garrett. He knew horses the way some people know music, just had an ear for them. I picked up what I could." "Did you like it? Working horses specifically?" He thought about that. "I was good at it," he said, which wasn't quite the same thing, and she seemed to understand the distinction. "Thomas wanted to breed quarter horses eventually," she said. She was looking at her coffee cup. "He had a plan. He was always making plans. He had it all laid out. Which bloodlines? What markets? How many head?" A pause. "He was good at plans, less good at making them happen." She said it without bitterness and without apology, with the particular clear-eyed tone of someone who loved a person while also knowing exactly who that person was. "The land is good for it," Elias said after a moment. She looked up. "For breeding? Good grass, good water now. The terrain is right. You've got the horses to start with." She looked at him in a way that told him she'd thought about this herself, thought about it and put it away because it was too large to carry alone. "That's a long-term proposition," she said. "Most things worth doing are." Another silence. The wind, the snow at the window. Somewhere in the barn, Duff shifted in his stall and settled. "You're planning to leave in spring," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "That was the arrangement," he said. "Yes," she said. It was. She stood and carried her cup to the basin and said goodnight and went to bed. And Elias sat in the empty kitchen for a while, looking at the lamp flame and not thinking about anything in particular, or trying not to. January was brutal in the way that only Wyoming January can manage. The temperature dropped so far below zero that the air itself seemed to solidify. The creek froze solid. 2 of the fence posts he'd set in October heaved up in the hard freeze and had to be reset, which meant chipping 3 feet down through ice-locked earth. The woodpile that had seemed adequate in October was going down faster than planned, and he had to make 3 separate trips into the foothills with the wagon to cut more, each trip taking most of a day in cold that made your fingers stop working right after about 20 minutes. He got sick in January, not dramatically sick, not the kind of sick that put you in bed for 2 weeks, just the grinding kind, the kind where your chest feels like there's a slow fire in it, and your head aches and everything you do takes slightly more effort than it should. He kept working. Of course he kept working. He'd worked sick on a dozen ranches in a dozen winters, and this was no different, except that Margaret noticed on the 3rd day. "You're sick," she said at breakfast, with the same directness she brought to everything. Not concerned or not showing it, just stating a fact. "I'm fine," he said. "Your voice sounds like gravel and you keep coughing, and when I came out to check on Nell this morning, you didn't hear me open the barn door, which means you're not sleeping right." She set a bowl in front of him. "Eat this." He looked at it. "What is it?" Cornmeal mush with honey. Don't make a face, Elias. He hadn't made a face. He was fairly sure he hadn't made a face. He ate the mush. It was, he had to admit, the right thing at that moment. The honey was local. She'd mentioned a beekeeper neighbor 2 farms over, and it had a particular earthy quality that tasted like the land itself. I can see to the animals today, she said, sitting down with her own coffee. You should rest. There's nothing I need to rest from, he said. You're going to get worse if you don't slow down. I'll get worse either way. Slowing down just means the animals wait longer. She looked at him with that expression, the one he'd come to recognize as her trying to decide whether arguing was worth the energy. At least come in at midday, she said finally. Eat something warm. That he agreed to. It lasted most of January, the sick, flaring up, and then receding, and then flaring again. She gave him honey in his coffee without being asked, and once, on a particularly bad morning, left a pot of broth on the stove with a note that said, "Only drink this," which he did. He would have said he didn't feel particularly looked after, but that would have been lying. He didn't know quite what to do with being looked after. Damn. February brought a week-long thaw, false spring. Everyone in this country knew it, a brief, cruel warmth that made you think the worst was past, and then stepped aside for another month of hard weather. Elias used the thaw to do the outdoor work he'd been putting off, replacing 2 more fence sections, clearing debris from around the barn foundation, beginning the slow process of reinforcing the corral. On the 3rd day of the thaw, a neighbor appeared. He came riding in on a thick-necked roan, a big man in his 50s, with a full beard going gray, and the look of a prosperous operation about him, in the particular way that prosperous people have when they're around people who aren't. He introduced himself as Harlan Cross, from the Cross Ranch over the next ridge, and he addressed himself entirely to Margaret, glancing at Elias only once with a casual dismissiveness that Elias recognized immediately. The hired man, that glance said. Not relevant. He dismounted and stood at the porch, hat in hand, the performance of courtesy without quite the substance of it, and said that he'd heard she'd had a hired man working the winter, and he'd come by to check on her. I'm perfectly fine, Margaret said. She was standing in the doorway with that particular stillness she had. Of course, of course. Cross smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. Still, this is a lot of land for one woman to manage, Margaret. I've said before. You've said before, yes, Margaret said. I remember. A pause. Cross glanced at Elias again, this time with a slightly different quality, assessing rather than dismissing. Well, Cross said, if you need anything, spring will bring its own troubles. My offer still stands. I'm aware of your offer, she said. Have a safe ride back, Harlan. He replaced his hat and rode out, and Margaret stood on the porch and watched him go until he cleared the gate. Elias came to stand beside her. What's his offer? He said. He wants to buy this place, she said. Her voice was flat. He's wanted it since before Thomas died. The creek runs onto his land. Whoever owns this property controls his water access. She paused. He came by twice last spring with lowball numbers and twice again in summer. He started sending his son in the fall. Cheaper to send the son. He'll keep coming, Elias said. He will, she agreed. She turned and went back inside. March came, and with it a particular quality of light, still cold, still hard, but with a thin edge of something warmer in the afternoon hours. The snow began to pull back from the south-facing slopes. The creek, which had run muffled and sluggish under its ice all winter, began to sound different, more present, more itself. Elias found himself looking at the calendar and then looking away from it. He'd planned to leave in spring. That was the arrangement. And it had been a fair arrangement. She'd held up her end, he'd held up his, and there was no reason in the world to complicate it. He was getting better at lying to himself than he'd been, but he wasn't good enough yet to make that last part stick. One evening in late March, he came inside to find Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper in front of her and a pencil that she'd been holding for a while without apparently writing anything. The paper had columns of numbers on it, partly completed. The ranch accounts, he guessed. She looked up when he came in. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. He sat down across from her. She looked at the paper, then at him. She was not a woman who fumbled for words as a rule, but she looked for them now with a care that told him what she was about to say cost her something. I can't. She stopped, started again. This past winter, what you've done here. She gestured at the general direction of the ranch beyond the kitchen walls. I know I'm not easy. I know I don't make things easy. She looked at the paper again, as if it might help. The truth is that I can't face another season like the one before you came. I don't know if I can do it alone again. She said it the way you'd make a confession that shamed you, directly, without softening, but with a visible cost. He waited. I'm not offering you more than what we've had, she said. Shelter and food and whatever this is. She waved a hand between them. But I'm asking you to stay. Through the next season. Maybe longer than that. I'll understand if... Yes, Elias said. She stopped, looked at him. I haven't finished. You said let you finish before I said anything. You've finished. I was going to say I'd understand if you... I heard what you were going to say, he said. The answer is yes. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere. She looked at him with an expression he'd come to recognize as her equivalent of something she'd never actually say. All right, she said, and she picked up the pencil and looked back at her columns of numbers. He went to put water on for coffee. Outside, in the last of the March evening, the creek was running freely, the ice gone, the water finding its way over the familiar stones. And for the first time in 18 years, Elias Mercer sat in a kitchen that felt like somewhere he might be staying. He wasn't sure what to do with that, but he figured he'd learn. Spring in Wyoming didn't arrive so much as it negotiated. 3 warm days, then a hard freeze, then a week of mud so deep it swallowed fence posts, then finally, reluctantly, real warmth. The kind that stayed, the kind you could start to count on. Elias stayed. He didn't make an announcement about it. He didn't move his things from the barn to the house or mark the occasion in any particular way. He just kept working, the same as he'd been working since October, and the calendar moved forward, and the understanding between them settled into something neither of them felt the need to examine too closely. Margaret had asked. He had said yes. That was enough to build on. April brought fencing work. Real fencing work. Not the emergency patching he'd been doing all winter, but the systematic mile-by-mile assessment and rebuilding of the entire perimeter. He walked every inch of it with Margaret on a Sunday morning in early April, the ground still soft from snowmelt, both of them carrying notebooks and making marks. She knew every weak section by memory and could tell him why each one had failed. Frost heave here, cattle pressure there, cheap wire Thomas had bought in a bad year when money was tight. She said it all matter-of-factly, without apology for Thomas, and without criticism either. Just the facts of the land. You loved him, Elias said at one point. Not a question exactly. They were standing at the northeast corner of the property, looking at a section of fence that had simply given up and lay flat on the still brown grass. Margaret was quiet for a moment. I did, she said. He was a good man, not always a practical one. She crouched to look at one of the collapsed posts. He was a dreamer, which is fine. Somebody has to be. She stood up. But dreamers need someone to keep the roof on while they're dreaming. And that was you. That was me. She made a note in her book. This whole section needs to come out and start over. He let it go, but he thought about it later. The quiet weight of being the one who keeps the roof on, year after year, while someone else does the dreaming. The particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being the responsible one, while the person you love gets to float a little. He thought he understood that more than he'd expected to. They started on the fencing the following week, and by the time May came, they had a rhythm to their days that felt less like an arrangement and more like something that had always been happening. He was up first, saw to the animals. She was up 20 minutes behind him, started breakfast. They ate, divided the day's tasks, went to work. At noon, they overlapped at the pump or the barn or the edge of whatever field needed attention, ate whatever she'd packed in the morning, talked about what still needed doing. In the evenings, she kept her accounts, and he repaired equipment by the lamp, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and both were all right. It was not uncomplicated. He wasn't going to pretend that. There were hard days. Days when she was short with him for reasons that had nothing to do with him. Grief that came up out of nowhere. Fatigue that went below the physical. the grinding awareness that the ranch was still behind where it needed to be. On those days, she'd snap at something small, the way he'd stacked the wood, or the order he'd fed the horses. And he'd say nothing, and she'd say nothing, and by evening she'd set his coffee in front of him with slightly more care than usual, which was the closest she came to apology and which he had learned to accept as one. And there were days when he woke up looking at the barn ceiling and had to spend a deliberate moment reminding himself why he was still here. Not because he wanted to leave, but that was the strange part, but because the habit of leaving was so ingrained that staying required active maintenance. He'd lived so long with one foot out the door that having both feet in the same place made him uneasy in ways he couldn't entirely explain. He talked to Duff about it sometimes. Late evenings in the barn, brushing the gelding down. Duff had the good sense not to offer opinions. "You're restless again," Margaret said one evening in late May. He looked up from the harness he was mending. "What makes you say that?" "You've been up before 4 every day this week. When you can't sleep, you work." She didn't look up from her own work. She was mending a split in a leather glove with a curved needle and thread, a tedious business. "You were up before 4 all of February when you were sick too. But that was different." He set down the harness. "I'm not going anywhere." "I didn't say you were." "You were thinking it." She finally looked up. "What I was thinking," she said carefully, "is that something is eating at you, and I'd rather know what it is than wonder." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the barn, a night bird called once and went silent. He'd have to figure out later what kind. "I'm not good at this," he said finally. "At what?" He gestured at the general shape of the life around them. The barn, the ranch, the arrangement, her. He didn't have a more specific word for it. She seemed to understand anyway. "Neither am I," she said. "Particularly." "You seem like you are." "I seem like I know what I'm doing with the land," she said. "That's different." She went back to the glove. "I spent 14 months doing this completely alone. I got very efficient. Efficient isn't the same as good at it." He picked the harness back up. They worked in silence for a while. "My wife left me," he said, 18 years ago. Margaret's hands didn't stop. "I didn't know you'd been married." "Most people don't. I don't usually mention it." He kept his eyes on the harness. She was a good woman. I wasn't a good husband. I was away more than I was home, and when I was home, I was already thinking about being away, and one day she was just done with it. She'd found someone else. A man who stayed put. He paused. "She made the right call." "Do you believe that?" "I do now. I didn't then." He turned the harness over in his hands. "I blamed her for a while. That was easier. Then I blamed myself for a longer while. That was less easy, but more honest. Then I just kept moving and stopped blaming anyone." "Do you have children?" "No, she did, eventually, with him." He said it without particular emotion, the clean, flat statement of someone who had processed a thing down to its bones. "I don't know them." "I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly. "It was a long time ago." "Things being a long time ago doesn't always make them shorter," she said. He looked at her. She was still working on the glove, her eyes down, and she'd said it in the same matter-of-fact tone she brought to everything. And he thought, she knows exactly what she's talking about. "No," he said. "I suppose not." They didn't talk about it again. But something changed slightly after that. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to and named. Just a slight adjustment in the atmosphere between them, the way pressure changes before weather. Like something had been put on the table and looked at and put back. But now both of them knew it was there. Summer came on fast and hot. This part of Wyoming could go from mud season to genuine heat in what felt like 3 days. And by June, the pastures were green and the horses were out all day, and the whole property had the particular busy quality of a ranch finally working at something like its potential. This was when Elias first started talking seriously about the horses. "You've got 3/4 horses and one of them is exceptional," he said one morning. He and Margaret were at the corral watching the 3 mares move. He meant Nell, a dark chestnut who moved like she was designed for it, smooth and powerful and light on her feet in a way the other 2 simply weren't. "I know Nell is good," Margaret said. "Thomas picked her out as a foal." "She's not just good," Elias said. "She's the kind of horse you breed from. If you found the right stud, that costs money. It costs money up front. It costs a lot more money to keep running this place the way it's running now, with 3 horses that aren't producing anything. She looked at him. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. I'm not talking about turning this into a full operation overnight, he said. I'm talking about one foal. Start there. See what you've got. And you know horses well enough to manage the breeding? I know horses well enough to manage the breeding, he said. I'd need to make some inquiries about bloodlines, find the right stud within a reasonable distance. But I know what I'm looking for. Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching Nell move along the fence line. Thomas wanted this, she said. Not sad exactly, something more complex. You talked about it for years. I know, Elias said. You told me. It feels strange to... She stopped, looked at Nell again. He's been gone 14 months. 16, Elias said gently. She looked at him surprised. I've been here 6 months, he said. You told me he'd been gone 10 when I arrived. She turned back to the corral. Her jaw was doing that thing, that subtle tightening that meant something was happening that she wasn't going to let be visible. The ranch doesn't care how long it's been, she said quietly, and he understood that she was telling herself this as much as she was telling him. It just keeps needing things done. That's true, he said. They stood there a moment longer, watching the horses. Find out about the stud, she said. Don't commit to anything, just find out. I will. He rode into town the following Thursday and spent 2 hours talking to a man at the livery about bloodlines, came back with 3 names written in his notebook and a rough sense of what quality service at each would cost. He laid it out for Margaret that evening. The costs, the realistic timeline, the market for quarter horses in the territory, and what a well-bred animal could bring at sale. She listened without interrupting, which was how he knew she was taking it seriously. The Garrison stud, she said when he finished. That's the one. He'd thought so too, but he'd wanted her to land on it herself. His operation is 2 days' ride east. We'd need to trailer Nell. The wagon can be fitted, she said. I've seen it done. I know how to fit it. Of course you do, she said, not unkindly. She looked at the numbers he'd laid out. We can afford this if I'm careful with the feed budget through fall. I can hunt, he said. Supplement the meat stores. Take some pressure off the feed budget. She looked up at him. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. I can. Another of those small silences that had their own language. All right, she said. He went to the Garrison Ranch in July. Nell loaded carefully in the modified wagon and came back 10 days later with the mare settled and a bill paid and a quiet satisfaction in the work. Margaret met him at the gate when he came in, checked Nell over with practiced hands, and when she was satisfied that the horse had traveled well, she let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding for the better part of 10 days. She looks good, Margaret said. She does, he agreed. They stood on either side of Nell in the late afternoon light, the horse between them like a shared secret. Thank you, Margaret said. She said it the way she always said thank you, directly, without decoration, making brief eye contact and then looking away. She's a good horse, Elias said. She'll throw good foals. I know she will, Margaret said. Summer moved into fall and Elias found himself looking at the ranch differently than he had in the winter. Not as a list of problems to be solved, but as a thing in the process of becoming. Fences that held, a well that worked, animals that thrived. And slowly, carefully, the beginning of something that might grow into what Thomas Holloway had dreamed about and what Margaret Holloway was going to build. The neighboring ranches were mixed in their opinions of the setup. He heard about it secondhand, mostly. People in town who'd ask questions in the careful way of people trying to understand a situation they found unusual without being rude about it. A widow and a hired man, working a ranch together through the winter, and now through the summer, with no sign of changing. People had thoughts. People in small frontier communities always had thoughts. Harlan Cross came back in September. He came with his son this time, a young man in his 20s who had his father's build and his father's eyes and considerably less subtlety than his father in trying to hide what he was after. They rode in on a Saturday morning when Elias was on the barn roof doing a final check before winter, high enough to see the whole property clearly. He watched them come up the trail and felt something he recognized from a long time ago. A particular alertness, not quite alarm, more like the instinct of an animal that has identified a thing that requires attention. He stayed on the roof. Margaret came out onto the porch. Cross dismounted and did his courtesy performance again. Hat, charm, the appearance of neighborly concern. His son stayed on his horse and looked at the barn and the fencing and the paddocks with the frank appraisal of someone pricing a thing he wants to buy. Elias couldn't hear the conversation from the roof, but he saw the shape of it, cross-talking, Margaret listening with her arms crossed and her weight back on her heels, the posture of someone who has made up her mind before the other person started talking, cross-gesturing at something, probably the property, probably the water, probably the number he was offering, which would be higher than last time. After about 10 minutes, Margaret went back inside. She didn't say goodbye and she didn't slam the door. She just went inside, which in her language was a complete and unambiguous statement. Cross stood on the porch for a moment and then looked up at the barn roof. He and Elias looked at each other from a distance of about 30 yards. Cross put his hat back on and rode out with his son. That evening, Elias mentioned it at dinner. Cross came by. "I know, I was there." She passed the bread without looking up. "He's going to keep coming. I know that too." "What does he offer?" She told him. He considered the number. It was actually fair, he had to admit, maybe even a little generous for the current state of the property. A year ago, it would have been more than the ranch was worth. Now, with the work they'd done, it was roughly accurate. "That's not an insult," he said. "That's a real number." She looked at him. "I know it's a real number." "I'm not saying take it," he said carefully. "I'm saying he's not just harassing you. He actually wants it." "Of course he wants it. He's always wanted it." She set her fork down. "Elias, I'm not selling this ranch. I know that." "Then why are we talking about it?" He thought for a moment. "Because I want you to know that I know the number is real, and I still think you're making the right call. There's a difference between being stubborn and being right. You're being right." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he'd never quite seen on her before. Something that had been braced for an argument and found something else instead. She picked her fork back up. "The foal will change the math," she said. "If Nell produces what I think she'll produce, by next spring we'll have something Cross can't undervalue." "Yes," Elias said. "We will." She noticed the we. He could see it. Just a flicker, the slight adjustment in her expression. Neither of them remarked on it. They kept eating. Nell's foal came the following March. A cold, clear morning with stars still out at 4 a.m., when Elias heard the mare's labor sounds and pulled on his boots and went. It was a long birth, harder than he'd hoped, though not dangerous. And Margaret was beside him within minutes, both of them working quietly by lamplight, talking the horse through it in low voices, doing the practical, steady things that needed doing. The foal was a colt, dark bay, with the build of his father and the particular quality of movement that Elias had seen in Nell and had been hoping to see in the offspring. He stood on shaky legs 20 minutes after birth and immediately walked toward the lamp, which made Margaret laugh. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that sounded like something uncoiling. He'd heard her laugh before, small things. Not like this. "Look at him," she said. She was crouched in the straw next to the foal, and the lamplight made the whole barn gold, and she was smiling in a way that changed her whole face. "He's not afraid of anything." "He's 20 minutes old," Elias said. "Give him time to develop a sensible amount of fear." "Don't say that." She looked up at him. "Let him be brave for 5 minutes." He sat down in the straw across from her, the foal between them, Nell turning to check her offspring with that ancient maternal assurance. The lamplight and the smell of hay and the particular piece of a thing going right for once. He looked at her across the foal's dark back, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "What are you going to call him?" he asked. She thought about it. "Venture," she said. "Thomas used to say—" She stopped, started again. "He used to say that everything worth doing was a venture, a risk you take on faith." She stroked the foal's neck. "I thought it was foolish when he said it. Now I think he was right." "Venture," Elias said. He turned the word over. "It suits him." They sat with the foal until the sky outside began to lighten, neither of them rushing, both of them knowing there would be a full day of work waiting once they left the barn. But for that hour between night and morning, they just sat in the straw with this new life between them and let themselves have the moment. It was one of the better hours Elias Mercer could remember. By the second year, The ranch had found its footing. Not prosperity exactly, not yet, but the feeling of ground underfoot that would hold. They took on a second breeding pair. The first foal sale brought a price that made Margaret go very quiet for a moment and then say, practically, that they should put half of it back into the operation. He agreed. They began talking about the East Field, whether to fence it properly and expand the breeding operation, what it would take, what they could realistically manage. They talked about it like partners. That was the word that had begun to settle over the arrangement without either of them putting it there. Not hired man and employer, not exactly. Not something with a cleaner name either. Just two people who had each decided, in their own cautious private ways, that this was the thing worth doing and had kept deciding it, day after day, until it stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a fact. It wasn't without friction. It never was, with two people who'd spent years learning to be self-sufficient and were now required to consult each other. He had opinions she disagreed with. She made decisions without telling him that he found out about later and didn't appreciate. They had arguments, thick, real ones, not just the sharp-edged silences of winter, but actual arguments, voices raised, points made badly and then better. One argument in the fall of the second year lasted 3 days in the sense that it went underground and then came back up when they both thought it was done. But they always came back to the table. He thought that was the thing, finally. The thing that made this different from anything he'd had before. They always came back to the table, not because they were required to, not because there was nowhere else to go, but because the table was where the work was, and the work was what they both cared about more than being right. One evening in early spring of the second year, she said something that he turned over in his mind for a long time afterward. They were on the porch after dinner, something they'd started doing when the weather allowed. Just sitting, which was the one thing neither of them was naturally inclined toward, but which they'd both somehow found themselves doing more of. The last light was going out of the sky over the foothills, that long Wyoming dusk that lasted longer than you thought it would. "I used to think staying in one place was settling," she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the view, the one she'd looked at every day for years. Like it meant you'd run out of ambition. "And now?" he said. She thought about it for a moment. "Now I think it takes more courage than leaving," she said. "Leaving is easy. You just go." She was quiet for a second. "Staying means you have to keep choosing it, every day, even when it's hard." He didn't say anything for a while. "I've been choosing it," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I've noticed." The foothills went dark, and the first stars came out over the ranch, and the horses moved in the paddock below with their easy, indifferent grace, and Elias Mercer sat on a porch in Wyoming and did not think about the road. The children arrived on a Tuesday in April, which Elias would later think was appropriate, April being the month that couldn't make up its mind about anything. He was in the East Field when Margaret came out to find him, walking fast in the way she only walked when something had changed, and she hadn't decided yet whether it was good or bad. He set down the post driver and waited. "There's a man from the county at the house," she said, "with 3 children." He looked at her. "What kind of man from the county?" "The kind with paperwork." She stopped a few feet away, and her expression was the careful blank she used when she was working something out in real time. "The Aldrich family. You remember I mentioned them, the farm over on the Riker Creek Road?" He did remember. She'd mentioned it once in passing, the way you mentioned something that's a tragedy, but not your tragedy. A family hit by fever the previous winter. Father dead, mother following him 6 weeks later. 3 children, he said, 8, 11, and 14, 2 boys and a girl. They've been with the county family in Laramie since January, but the arrangement's fallen through. She looked at him steadily. He says there's no one else. And he came here. I have a reputation, apparently, for taking on lost causes. She said it without any particular lightness, just stated it as a fact about herself that she'd apparently accepted. Elias picked up the post driver and set it against the fence. He thought about the 2 extra rooms at the back of the house that had been used for storage since before he arrived. He thought about the hay budget and the meat stores and the fact that the breeding operation was growing but still not large. He thought about a lot of things in the space of about 4 seconds. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him with something that might have been gratitude and might have been relief, that he'd asked rather than told, that he'd made it her question to answer. "I want to say yes," she said. "I think it would be complicated and expensive, and I want to say yes anyway." Then say yes, he said. She turned and walked back toward the house. He watched her go and then picked up where he'd left off with the fence post. The children were named Samuel, who was 14 and had the shut-down, watchful expression of a boy who had learned that adults made promises they didn't keep. Clara, who was 11 and asked questions constantly in a way that suggested she was afraid of what happened when the room went quiet. And Peter, who was 8 and hadn't said more than 4 words since January according to the county man's paperwork, and who looked at everything with enormous dark eyes that seemed to be doing most of his communicating for him. They arrived with one trunk between the 3 of them. Elias moved the storage out of the 2 back rooms himself over 2 evenings and found a cot for Peter to share with Samuel and repaired a bed frame that had been leaning against the wall since he'd arrived. Margaret cleaned the rooms with the focused efficiency she brought to all domestic tasks, not making it into a production, just doing the work. She found extra blankets from a chest in her own room and put them on the beds without comment. The first week was difficult in the particular way that all first weeks are when strangers are required to be a household before they've earned it. Samuel was 17 kinds of sullen. Clara talked so much that even Margaret, who was patient about such things, had to remove herself to the barn twice just to get some quiet. Peter sat at the kitchen table each morning and ate whatever was put in front of him with careful, methodical attention, like he was afraid that stopping would mean something. Elias mostly stayed out of the way. He wasn't good with children. He knew this about himself, had always known it, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He didn't try to be warm in ways that would have felt false. He just kept working and let the children see him working and didn't demand anything from them. Samuel was the one who cracked first, which surprised him because Samuel had seemed the most armored. It was in the barn 3 weeks after they'd arrived. Elias was teaching himself a new splicing technique on some old rope, something he'd seen done in Kansas and always meant to learn properly. And Samuel appeared in the barn door and stood there in the way of a person who wants to ask something but hasn't given himself permission yet. "What?" Elias said, not unkindly, just directly. "Can I help with something?" Samuel said. It cost him to ask. That was visible. Elias looked at him for a moment. "You know anything about horses?" "Some. My dad had 2 work horses." "Come here," Elias said, and handed him the rope. "Watch what I do with my hands and do the same." Samuel came in and sat on a hay bale and watched and tried it himself, badly at first, then less badly. They worked in silence for 20 minutes before Samuel said stiffly, like he was reporting a fact, "Peter hasn't talked since my mom died." "I know," Elias said. "Your county paperwork mentioned it." "He talked before. He used to talk all the time." Samuel looked at the rope in his hands. He was annoying about it. "He probably will be again," Elias said. "Give him time." Samuel was quiet. Then, "How do you know?" "I don't," Elias said, "but I've seen people go quiet after bad things and come back. Doesn't always happen. Usually does." Samuel nodded once, a short, tight nod, and went back to the rope. That was how it started. Not with a conversation about grief or loss or what the future held. Just rope splicing in a barn on a spring afternoon, and an 8-word exchange that neither of them would remember exactly, but that changed something between them enough that Samuel started showing up at the barn in the mornings without being asked. Clara's integration was easier and louder and involved approximately 400 questions about horses, which Elias answered with varying degrees of patience, and Margaret answered with the calm thoroughness of a woman who genuinely enjoyed explaining things. It was Margaret who discovered that Clara had a gift for numbers. Actual mathematical intuition, the kind that let her look at the ranch accounts and spot a discrepancy that Margaret herself had missed. Margaret put her to work on the books, gave her a small desk at the edge of the kitchen, and Clara's questions slowly shifted from, "Why do horses sleep standing up?" to, "Why do we pay more for this supplier than for this one when this one is closer?" Peter was the long project. He ate, he followed people. If Elias was mending fence, Peter would appear and sit nearby and watch without offering to help and without getting in the way. If Margaret was in the kitchen, Peter would position himself at the table in his customary chair and track her movements around the room with those dark eyes. He wasn't afraid of either of them. He just hadn't found anything worth saying yet. 6 weeks in, Elias was with Venture in the paddock. The colt was 2 years old now and in training, still erratic, still working things out the way young horses do. when he heard a sound behind him and turned to find Peter standing at the paddock rail, chin resting on the top board, watching the horse with an expression of pure, uncomplicated attention. Venture, who was suspicious of most things, turned and walked directly over to the boy and put his nose against Peter's small hand. "He likes you," Elias said. A pause. "His name's Venture," Peter said. His voice came out rough from disuse, like a hinge that needed oiling. "That's right," Elias said. He kept his voice very even, like the sound itself might spook something. "You want to come in and say hello to him properly?" Another pause, longer. Then Peter climbed through the fence rails with the ease of a child who'd been around livestock before and stood next to Venture and put both hands flat on the horse's neck. Margaret was watching from the barn door. Elias saw her, didn't look at her directly, kept his eyes on Peter and Venture. He heard her go back inside. That was the beginning of Peter's return to the world. It went through the horse. Everything did, for a while. He started talking to Venture first, which Elias pretended not to hear, and then to Elias about Venture, and then eventually to everyone about everything, in a voice that was still quieter than it had probably been before January, but that was present, that was there. By the end of that first summer, the Holloway Ranch had become something different, fuller, louder, more complicated, and somehow more itself than it had been when it was just a widow and a drifter working against the cold. The children changed the work too. Samuel took on real responsibility in the barn by fall, and while he still had the particular prickliness of a teenage boy who'd been hurt and hadn't finished deciding how to feel about it, he worked with a relentlessness that reminded Elias uncomfortably of himself at that age. Clara managed the supply accounts with Margaret and began corresponding with a feed supplier in Cheyenne who gave them better pricing when she pointed out their volume justified it. Peter cleaned stalls with a methodical care that was better than most grown hands Elias had known. They weren't a family yet, not in any formal sense, not in any sense that anyone had named. But they worked like one, and they ate like one. And on winter evenings, the house had the particular weighted warmth of a place that is full of people who are, against their various private expectations, glad to be where they are. It was in the third year that the sky stopped doing its part. The spring of that year was dry, not alarmingly so. Dry springs happened, everyone knew that, and the experienced ranchers watched the sky with familiar patience and waited for the May rains that usually came. May was dry. June was dry. The creek dropped 2 feet in 4 weeks. The grass in the east pasture went from green to yellow to a kind of dull tan that Elias had seen before. In Kansas, in the year before a drought that lasted 18 months. He didn't say anything about Kansas, not yet, but he began paying attention differently. He watched the sky, and he watched the soil, and he watched the way the wind came off the foothills. Hotter than usual, carrying less moisture than it should. He dug a small hole in the east field and looked at the soil 6 inches down, and what he found there made him stand up and stare at the horizon for a while. "How bad is it?" Margaret said that evening. She'd seen him in the field. She missed very little. "Dry all the way down," he said, "deeper than last year's dry spells." She was quiet. "You've seen a drought before," he said. "Not a real one. Dry seasons, yes. Thomas saw one before we came here. He talked about it." She set her coffee down. "How do we prepare?" "Carefully," he said, "and we start now." They pulled water from the creek while it was still running and stored it in every container they had, filling the rain barrels twice over, setting up additional troughs that Elias built from lumber in the lean-to. He scouted the creek upstream and identified the sections most likely to maintain flow the longest. They reduced the horse herd by 2, a painful decision that Margaret made without flinching, selling 2 of the second-year foals earlier than they'd planned, at prices lower than they'd wanted, because animals already sold didn't need water they didn't have. The rains didn't come in July. They didn't come in August. By September, the creek was a trickle over stones, and the east pasture was dust, and the well Elias had relined in his first winter here, that he'd believed was solid, was dropping at a rate that made him check it twice a day and do the math each time with a knot in his stomach. The neighbors were feeling it too. At the general store in town, the talk had the particular quality of people who were scared but weren't ready to say so yet. Careful assessments of rainfall totals, comparisons to previous dry years, a collective effort to make this year look like something they'd seen before and survived. Harlan Cross wrote in that October. He didn't do the courtesy performance this time. He just rode up to where Elias was working near the gate and sat on his horse and looked at the dry ground and said, without preamble, "This is going to be bad." "I know," Elias said. "Bad enough that some of these small operations don't come through it." Cross looked at the house. "I raised my offer. Fair price, given the circumstances." "Her answer isn't going to change," Elias said. "Her answer should change," Cross said, not unkindly, just with the flat certainty of a man who'd done the math. "I've been doing this 30 years. I know what a 2-year drought does to a place without deep resources." "So do I," Elias said, "and I'm not going to have this conversation on her behalf. You want to make an offer, you make it to Mrs. Holloway directly." Cross looked at him for a long moment with the appraising expression he'd had since the beginning, trying to figure out what Elias was, exactly, in relation to this woman and this ranch. Then he nodded once and rode on without going to the house. Elias watched him go, and then went inside and told Margaret that Cross had raised his offer and what it was. She listened. She didn't say anything for a while. "What do you think we should do?" she said. It was the first time she'd asked him that about this particular question, and both of them registered the shift. He sat down across from her. He thought about it honestly, because she deserved honest. "I think we should not sell," he said. "I think it's going to be brutal, and I think some of what we've built is going to be damaged, and I think we'll come through it if we're careful and if we're lucky. And I think if we sell now, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering." He paused. "But I'm not the one who loses everything if I'm wrong." "Neither am I," she said. "Not anymore." She glanced toward the back of the house, where they could hear Clara's voice asking Samuel something and Samuel's quieter answer. "None of us are." He hadn't thought of it that way. He had now. "Then I think we don't sell," she said, "and I think we figure out the water." The water was the problem at the center of everything. Without it, the horses couldn't be maintained, and without the horses, the breeding operation died, and without the breeding operation, the ranch had no future, and Cross's offer became the best option. Elias had been turning the water problem over in his mind for weeks, looking at it from different angles, and he kept coming back to the same idea that he kept dismissing because it seemed too uncertain, too expensive, too unlikely to work. He went back to it now. "I want to dig deeper," he said. Margaret looked at him. "The well we have goes down about 30 feet. The water table's dropped. That's why it's failing. But in country like this, there are usually deeper aquifers, underground water that doesn't respond to surface drought the same way." "Usually," she said, picking out the word precisely. "Usually," he confirmed. "There's no guarantee. Digging deeper and finding nothing is a real possibility." "How much deeper?" "Could be another 20 feet, could be 50, could be we dig a new location entirely if the geology's right." "Can you do this without a drilling rig?" "Not efficiently," he said. "But I know how to hand dig a cased well if the soil cooperates and I have help. Samuel's strong enough, and I can hire day labor from town." She was doing the math. He could see it, the rapid internal calculation of cost against reserves, against risk, against time. "The water we have stored buys us maybe 6 weeks, she said. "About that. If you dig and find nothing, we've spent money and time we can't get back." "Yes." "And if you find something? Then we have water. And water is everything." She looked at him for a long time. "Start planning it," she said. The first well site failed. He'd chosen it based on the best information he had. Soil type, the direction the water table should be running, the location relative to the creek. He and Samuel dug for 9 days, fighting rocky ground that got harder as they went. And at 60 feet they had moisture, but not enough to sustain the ranch through a serious drought. He stood at the bottom of that hole on the 9th day and looked at the walls around him and thought about the money spent and the time gone and Margaret's face when he came in to tell her. Samuel's voice came from above. "Is there water?" "Some," Elias said. "Not enough." A pause. Then Samuel's face appeared at the top, looking down at him in the narrow circle of daylight. "What do we do?" "Pull me up," Elias said, "and then we find a better spot." Margaret took the news with that set jaw and no visible emotion, which he'd learned to read as her processing, rather than not feeling. "Where else?" she said. He spread his notes on the kitchen table, rough geological observations, soil samples, the direction of the old creek bed before it had shifted sometime in the past, property maps he'd gotten from the county surveyor on his last trip to town. He pointed to a spot on the southwest corner of the property, near where an old cottonwood stand grew. Trees like that grow where moisture collects, he said. The old creek bed ran through that area. I found the remnant channel under the grass last spring. Underground, the soil structure should be different. Should be, she said. Should be, he agreed. Clara, who was sitting at her desk in the corner pretending to do accounts, said, without looking up, "The Graves Ranch found water at 80 feet on their southwest corner, and they have the same soil as us." They both looked at her. "I talked to Mrs. Graves at the supply store last week," Clara said, still looking at her papers. "She mentioned it. I thought it might be relevant." A silence. "It's relevant," Margaret said. "I thought so," Clara said. Elias looked at the map and then at Margaret and felt something very complicated move through his chest. Gratitude for the girl, and something else about Margaret, and something about this whole arrangement that he still didn't have the right word for. "Southwest corner," he said. "Southwest corner," she said. The second dig started in the third week of October. The ground was cold but workable, and the cottonwood roots, which complicated the first 20 feet considerably, gave way below to a sandy loam that was easier going. He and Samuel worked in shifts, one in the hole and one at the top managing the bucket and rope system they'd rigged. Margaret ran supplies and kept track of the shoring timbers that kept the walls from collapsing. Peter, at Margaret's insistence, stayed well back from the hole. She'd read enough about well cave-ins to be specific about this, and she was not negotiable on the topic. 20 feet, 30, 40, 50. At 52 feet, Elias was at the bottom in the cold dark with a lamp and a short-handled pick, and his arms were burning and his back had stopped communicating its complaints because it had moved past the point where complaints seemed useful. He swung the pick into the south wall, and the ground there gave differently than it had. A softer resistance, a slight change in the sound. He dug at it with his hands. The soil was wet. He pressed his palm flat against the wall and felt, unmistakably, the seep of water through the earth. Cold and thin, but real. "Samuel!" he called up. A pause. Then Samuel's voice, tense. "Yeah." "Go get your mother." Another pause. "Good or bad?" Elias pressed his hand against the wet wall again. "Go get her," he said. It took another 2 days to widen and case the bottom of the well and determine what they had. What they had, it turned out, was not a flood, not a gusher, not a dramatic discovery. What they had was a slow, steady seep from a deep limestone formation that sat below the drought-affected water table and fed from somewhere much further up in the foothills, somewhere the drought hadn't reached the same way. It wasn't infinite. It wasn't going to solve everything, but it was real water, coming up slow and cold and reliable. And when Elias pulled the first full bucket from that depth and set it on the ground at the top of the well shaft, Margaret looked at it for a long moment and then reached out and put her hand in it. "It's cold," she said. "Deep water is," he said. She looked at him. He was filthy. 2 weeks of digging in him, a bruise across his left shoulder from a shoring timber that had shifted wrong on the second day, 30 years of physical labor in every line of his body. "You did it," she said. "We needed it," he said. "That's not what I said." He held her gaze for a moment. Around them, Samuel stood with his hands on his knees, catching his breath, and Claire had come running from the house when Samuel went to get Margaret and was now standing at the edge of the well looking down into it. And Peter was there too, pressed against Margaret's side with one hand in hers, looking at the bucket of cold water like it was the most important thing he'd ever seen, which it might have been. That night, after the children were in bed, Elias sat on the porch in the cold, and Margaret brought him coffee and sat beside him. The sky was the particular black of a winter sky with no clouds, stars everywhere, the kind of night that made the scale of things felt. "Neighbors are selling," she said. "The Praters. And I heard the Dunfields are considering it." "I know," he said. "I heard the same. Cross is going to have more land than he knows what to do with by the time this is over. Probably." She held her coffee in both hands and looked at the dark shape of the hills against the sky. "I almost asked you to leave," she said. He turned to look at her. "Last month, when the first well failed and I couldn't see the way out of it." She kept her eyes on the hills. I thought you should go before it got worse, before you lost more time on something that wasn't going to survive." "Why didn't you?" "Because you would have refused," she said. "And then we would have had an argument, and I was too tired for it." He looked at her for a long moment. I wouldn't have left, he said. I know that, she said. I knew it then too, which is the only reason I didn't ask, because I knew you'd stay regardless, and I was afraid of... She stopped. Afraid of what? He said. She was quiet for a moment. Of you staying for me instead of staying because you'd chosen to, she said. There's a difference. He thought about that. About the distinction she was drawing to fine and real, and exactly the kind of thing he would never have been able to articulate himself but recognized immediately when she said it. I chose to stay, he said. I keep choosing it. That hasn't changed. She nodded once, looked back at the hills. The water won't last forever, she said. Even the deep aquifer. If the drought goes another year, then we manage, he said. Less stock, more conservation. We've been wasteful with the creek water. I've been thinking about that. There are ways to capture and redirect that I haven't tried yet. Tell me, he told her. She listened the way she always did. Exactly, asking questions, pushing back on two things, and agreeing with the rest. By the time the coffee was cold, they had the rough shape of a plan for the winter water management, and the plan wasn't comfortable and it wasn't going to be easy, but it was real, and real was what they had to work with. He went inside. She stayed on the porch a few minutes longer, looking at the stars, and when she finally came in, she paused in the kitchen doorway. Elias, she said. He turned. I'm glad you stopped at that fence, she said. That first day. I'm glad you didn't ride on. He looked at her in the lamp-lit kitchen for a moment. This woman who never said things she didn't mean and never said them lightly. So am I, he said. She went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, listening to the house settle in the cold, and thought about water that came from deep enough to outlast what was happening on the surface, about things that held when the ground above them gave way. Outside, the drought was still there. The land was still hard and dry and waiting. But inside that house, 4 people were asleep under the same roof, and the well was cold and real and going to last through the night. And Elias Mercer sat in the kitchen that he had come to think of as his own and did not feel like a man who had run out of things worth holding on to. He felt for the first time in a very long time like a man who had found the right place to stand. The second year of drought was worse than the first. Not dramatically worse, not in the way of sudden catastrophes, which at least have the decency to announce themselves clearly. It was worse the slow way, the grinding way, the way of increments so small that each individual day seemed manageable right up until the morning you stepped outside and looked at your land and understood, with a clarity that hit like cold water, that the accumulation had become something you could no longer minimize. The deep well held. That was the thing that kept everything else from collapse. That slow, cold seep from the limestone formation that Elias had found in October, which continued delivering water through the second dry spring and into the punishing summer that followed. Not abundantly, not without careful management, but it held. Everything else required sacrifice. They sold 6 more horses in the spring, animals that had taken 2 years of careful breeding to produce, and that went for prices that made Clara wince and write the numbers down in the accounts ledger with the expression of someone recording a loss they want the record to remember. The remaining stock was rationed on water with a precision that Elias tracked daily, adjusting allocations based on temperature and workload, and which animals were showing signs of stress. Margaret handled the pasture rotation herself, moving horses between the 4 remaining sections of viable grass on a schedule that squeezed every possible day of grazing from ground that was giving less each week. Samuel turned 17 that summer and had grown into someone who was going to be large, already taller than Elias, with hands that had thickened from 3 years of real ranch work into something that matched the rest of him. He drove the water wagon to the creek twice a day without being asked, took readings on the well depth each morning and reported them at breakfast, and had developed the particular economical quality of movement that comes from years of doing physical work alongside someone who doesn't waste motion. He'd absorbed Elias's habits without either of them intending it. One evening in July, when the temperature had been over 100 for 11 straight days and the last of the east pasture grass had gone to a fine gray dust, Samuel found Elias at the fence line staring at the sky. "You think it's going to rain," Samuel said. It wasn't quite a question. "I think it might," Elias said. "Something's changing in how the air feels." Samuel stood beside him and looked at the same sky. You've said that 3 times this summer. I know. Hasn't rained yet. I know that too. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then, with the careful casualness of a 17-year-old trying not to reveal that something matters to him, we're going to be okay, right? Elias considered lying. He was briefly tempted by the version of this conversation where he said, of course, in a confident voice and sent the boy back to work, reassured. But Samuel was 17 and had buried both his parents and had been doing a man's work for 3 years, and he deserved better than comfortable lies. I think so, Elias said. I'm not certain, but I think so. Samuel nodded once with that short, tight motion that Elias had seen from his first week on the ranch, and that hadn't changed in 3 years. Okay, he said. That's enough. He went back to work. Elias stayed at the fence line a while longer, looking at the sky, and thought about what it meant that I think so was enough for a 17-year-old boy. That this kid had recalibrated his expectations so thoroughly that honest uncertainty felt like reassurance. He thought that was either a very sad thing or a very mature thing, and he wasn't sure which. The rains came in September, not all at once. Not in the dramatic sense of clouds opening up and washing everything clean the way stories like to arrange it. They came as a series of storms across 3 weeks, each one adding a little more to what the ground had been denied for 2 years, soaking down through the cracked soil in layers, refilling things from the bottom up. The creek rose, the well depth stabilized, and then, over 2 weeks, began to recover. The gray dust in the east pasture showed the first tentative suggestion of green. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway the morning after the 3rd storm and looked at the wet ground for a long time. It's not over, she said. Not to anyone in particular, to herself mostly. No, Elias said from behind her. But it's different. She turned around. He was at the table with coffee and the water usage ledger from the past 2 years laid open in front of him. Pages of daily figures in his careful handwriting, the record of every calculation and adjustment and difficult decision from the past 24 months. We need to talk about what comes next, he said. She came to the table and sat across from him. This was how they had always done the important things, at this table, with coffee, without ceremony. The herd needs to be rebuilt, she said. Slowly, he said. We shouldn't push it. I know. But the reputation's still there, or most of it. I had a letter from the Garrison people last spring, even in the middle of all of this, asking about spring foals. They knew we were in drought, and they still asked. Because they know the bloodlines, Elias said. That's what survives. The quality doesn't go away because the weather went bad. She looked at the ledger. Clara's been corresponding with a buyer in Colorado. A man named Whitfield, he runs a large operation outside of Denver. He's interested in quarter horses specifically, working horses, not show stock. She paused. The numbers she's worked out are better than anything we've gotten locally. How old is she now? 15, Margaret said, and then, with a slight change in her expression, that was the nearest she usually came to wonder. 15 years old, and she negotiated a better freight arrangement than I could have. Elias had seen Clara's letters to the Colorado buyer, had seen one by accident, left open on the kitchen desk, and had read 2 sentences before he realized what he was reading, and then read the rest because it was simply remarkable. Precise, professional, with a grasp of pricing and logistics that most adults he'd known in the cattle and horse trade didn't have. She got that from you, he said. She got the math from herself, Margaret said. She got the nerve from watching you tell Harlan Cross no 4 times and mean it every time. He looked at her. She said it plainly, without decoration, the way she said things that were true. What about Samuel? He said. Samuel wants to stay, Margaret said. He told me last month. He said... She stopped, pressed her lips together for a moment in the way she did when something was more than she'd intended to say. He said this is the only place that has ever felt permanent to him. That's the word he used. Permanent. Elias looked down at the ledger. And Peter, he said. Peter, Margaret said, and her voice had a different quality on that name, something softer, or maybe just more careful. Peter is going to be whatever he decides to be. He's 10 years old and he already understands horses better than most men I've met, but I'm not going to plan his future for him. Elias nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, the wet ground was doing what wet ground does, releasing the particular smell of soil and moisture and something older underneath, the smell of things reconsidering themselves. "I want to make it official," Margaret said. He looked up. "The children," she said. "I've been in contact with the county. It's possible, not easy, but possible, to make a formal legal arrangement, a guardianship." She was looking at the table, not at him. "I should have done it sooner. I kept telling myself there wasn't time, but the truth is She stopped. "I was afraid of what it meant." "What does it mean?" he said quietly. "It means I'm choosing them," she said. "Not just keeping them, actually choosing them." She looked up. "The way you chose to stay." He held her gaze. The rain had stopped the night before, but the eaves were still dripping, a slow, irregular sound against the ground outside, and the morning was gray and wet, and the kitchen lamp was still on because the light hadn't fully come yet. "Then make it official," he said. She nodded. Once, decisive, the nod of a woman who had made up her mind before she raised the subject and only needed to hear herself say it out loud. The legal process took most of the fall. County paperwork, a magistrate in Laramie, correspondence that Clara helped draft with a precise and serious attention that made the magistrate's clerk write a note in the margin of his file that Margaret found later and saved without showing anyone. It was finalized on a cold day in November, and Margaret came back from Laramie with the papers in an envelope that she put on the kitchen table when all 3 children were home. She told them what it meant. She did it plainly, without ceremony, the way she'd always done important things. Clara cried immediately, in the sudden flooding way of someone who'd been holding something in for a long time and was relieved to put it down. Samuel did not cry, but he got up from the table and went outside, and Elias could see him through the kitchen window standing in the yard for about 10 minutes, his back to the house, his hands in his pockets, and when he came back and his eyes were red, but his voice was level. "Okay," he said. "Good," and sat back down. Peter looked at the papers on the table and then at Margaret and said very seriously, "Does this mean I can name the next foal?" A startled silence. Then Margaret laughed. That sudden real laugh that Elias had first heard the night Venture was born, the one that changed her whole face. "Yes," she said. "You can name the next foal." "Good," Peter said. "I've been thinking about it. And the ranch recovered the way land recovers. Not overnight, not in a single satisfying transformation, but in the patient accumulation of better seasons layered over bad ones. The second spring after the drought broke, the east pasture was green again, fully green, and the creek ran at normal depth from snowmelt through late summer, and the breeding stock produced 4 foals, 2 of which were exceptional in ways that Elias could see from their first days of movement. The particular quality that he'd learned to identify, and that Margaret could see now as clearly as he could. The Colorado buyer Whitfield came to the ranch in person that summer. He was a compact, serious man in his 50s who said very little and watched everything, and he spent 2 hours with the horses and about 20 minutes with Elias and Margaret before he made an offer that was fair and substantial and that Clara had to be asked to leave the table for because she was 13, 15, Elias corrected himself. And Whitfield didn't negotiate with children, even if the child in question had been corresponding with his office for a year and knew more about his operations needs than most of his own staff. Clara left the room without argument and then sat in the hallway just outside the door, which everyone knew and no one mentioned. After Whitfield left, having shaken hands on terms that would hold through the following 3 years, Clara came back in and sat at her desk and opened her ledger. "He underbid on the freight," she said. "I know," Margaret said. "You took it anyway." "I took it because he'll come back," Margaret said. "A buyer who comes back for 3 years is worth more than 1 extra freight payment." A pause. Then Clara wrote something in the ledger. "All right," she said. "That makes sense." "I know it does," Margaret said. "I'll tell you when my reasoning doesn't make sense." "You could just let me sit in on the negotiations," Clara said. "In 2 years," Margaret said. 1.5. 2. Elias kept his eyes on the equipment he was cleaning and said nothing, and across the table from him Samuel was doing the same, and both of them understood without having to discuss it that this was not a conversation that required their involvement. The reputation grew the way reputations do when they're based on something real, not through advertising or claims, but through the accumulated testimony of people who had bought a Holloway horse and found it was exactly what they'd been told it was. Buyers came from further away. A man from Utah, a ranching operation in New Mexico that sent a letter asking about breeding availability 18 months in advance. Harlan Cross came one more time, in the spring of the 4th year after the drought. He came without his son, and he came without the performance. No hat in hand, no neighborly pretense. He rode up to where Elias was working and dismounted and stood with his reins in his hand and looked at the ranch. "I'm not making an offer," he said. "All right," Elias said. "I just want you to know I understand now that I was wrong about this place." Cross looked at the paddocks, the horses, the rebuilt barn that they'd finally torn down and reconstructed the previous fall. "I thought it was going to fold. Most places like it did. I was wrong." Elias looked at him. "What changed your mind?" "Whitfield," Cross said. "He mentioned the Holloway horses to me. We have mutual business. He said—" Cross paused, as if deciding how much to quote. "He said he'd never seen a small operation with that level of quality consistency." "Margaret knows her bloodlines," Elias said. "I can see that now." Cross put his hat back on. "I'm sorry about the water situation. When Thomas was alive, I pushed harder than I should have." Elias considered him for a moment. "You should tell her that." "Not me," Cross nodded. He went to the house and spent 15 minutes on the porch with Margaret while Elias kept working. He didn't hear what was said. Afterward, Cross rode out, and Margaret came to where Elias was and stood beside him looking at the retreating figure. "He apologized," she said. "I know, I told him to." She looked at him. "He didn't have to." "No," Elias said, "he didn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I accepted it." "Good," he said. "It didn't fix anything," she said. "Apologies mostly don't," he said, "but they count for something anyway." She looked at the horizon where Cross had disappeared and then back at the ranch. Her ranch, their ranch, the thing that had nearly broken and hadn't. Samuel was in the far paddock working with one of the young colts, the same patient, methodical approach that Elias had taught him and that he'd made his own. Clara was visible through the kitchen window at her desk. Peter had gone to the barn an hour ago, and Elias could hear, faintly, the sound of him talking to the horses in that quiet, continuous murmur that was entirely his own and that always put the animals at ease. "Thomas would have liked what this became," Margaret said. It was the first time in a long while she'd mentioned him without being asked. She said it simply, as a statement of fact rather than an act of grief. "Tell me what you think he'd have liked best," Elias said. She thought about it. "The horses," she said. "He would have loved to see the horses." She paused. "And the children. He always wanted children." He would have liked Clara arguing about freight rates. A small sound escaped her that was part way to a laugh. "He would have let her win," she said. "He was soft that way." "Was he?" "He was." She said it fondly, without apology. "He would have been terrible at telling her no. I would have had to be the one." "You're good at it," Elias said. "I've had practice," she said. They stood there for a while longer, the two of them, in the particular easy silence that had taken years to build. And that was, Elias thought, maybe the thing he was most grateful for. Not the ranch's survival, not the horses, not even the children. This, the ability to stand next to another person in silence and have it feel like company rather than absence. "Elias," she said. "I need you to know something." He turned to look at her. She was still looking at the ranch, at the land, at the thing that had survived the worst weather in a generation through stubbornness and planning, and the particular refusal of two imperfect people to give up on something worth holding on to. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, "of any of this." She gestured at the ranch, the land, the sky above it. "I used to wake up afraid every morning. I didn't tell you that, but I did. For years." She paused. "I don't anymore." He looked at her profile, the jaw, the dark eyes, the 40-some years her face had accumulated and made into something more interesting than youth. "When did it stop?" he said. She thought about it. "About the time you came up from the bottom of that well with water on your hands," she said. "I think that was it." He looked back at the land. "That was a long time ago. Yes," she said. "It was." And something in her voice made it sound like that was exactly right, like a long time was what it was supposed to take, And she was satisfied with that, and with this, and with all of it. Samuel's voice carried across from the far paddock, calling something to the colt that they couldn't quite make out. The colt answered with the short, sharp sound of a young horse finding its confidence. The creek, running full and easy now, made its familiar sound along the south boundary, and the east pasture was green in the late afternoon light, and Elias Mercer stood on the land that he had chosen and let himself, without qualification, call it his own. Time does not move the same way on a working ranch as it does in other places. In a city, years announce themselves. New buildings go up, streets change, fashions shift, and the passage of time has visible evidence everywhere you look. On a ranch, the years fold into each other in a way that makes them hard to count individually. The same fences, the same fields, the same particular quality of light coming off the foothills in October. The changes are real, but they're slow, layered, the way sediment builds. And then one morning you step outside and the person beside you moves differently than they used to. And the children you watched learn to splice rope are suddenly grown people with their own opinions and their own ways of doing things. And you understand that a great deal of time has passed without your full attention. Elias was 61 years old before he fully understood this. He was mending a section of fence on the south boundary, the same south boundary he had walked with Margaret on a Sunday morning in the first spring after he stayed, making notes in a small book. When Samuel rode up on a horse that was one of Venture's offspring, now 6 years old and moving with the same uncanny quality his sire had. Samuel was 30 now. He had a wife, a woman named Ruth, who had come from a ranch family in the next county and who had the good sense to recognize immediately what the Holloway operation was and what it was worth. And they had 2 children of their own, a girl of 4 and a boy who had just turned 2 and who already showed signs of being the kind of person who would require a great deal of watching. Samuel dismounted and stood next to Elias at the fence without saying anything for a moment, which was still his way, which would probably always be his way. "Clara's here," Samuel said finally. "I know. I heard the wagon. She brought her husband and the boys." Clara had married this Colorado buyer's son, not Whitfield himself, who was 20 years too old for her and had never shown the slightest interest, but his son Marcus, who had come with his father on a buying trip when Clara was 19 and had spent 3 days finding excuses to be in whatever room she was in. They had a house in Denver and 3 boys under the age of 7, and Clara ran the accounting for 2 separate operations from her kitchen desk, while managing the household with the same focused efficiency that had made her keep mental notes on freight discrepancies at the age of 11. "And Peter?" Elias said. "Rides up tomorrow," Samuel said. "He sent word." Peter was 25 now and lived on the ranch still. Had never particularly wanted to leave, had built himself a small house on the east end of the property 4 years ago with Samuel's help and Elias's, a project that had taken most of a fall and gone wrong in several interesting ways before it was finished. He managed the breeding operation day to day with a feel for the animals that was, Elias had come to believe, simply a natural gift, the kind you couldn't teach and couldn't explain and were lucky to be around. He had been quietly seeing a young woman from town for about a year, a quiet, serious person named Alice, who worked at the schoolhouse and who asked better questions about horses than most people in the territory. They were all coming because of Margaret. She had slowed in this past 2 years in a way that was not dramatic, but was undeniable. The way a river slows as it approaches a wider, calmer place. She still rose early. She still had opinions about the horses and the accounts and the fence line on the north property that needed attention, but she moved more carefully now, and some mornings Elias could see the effort it cost her to move at all, though she would not acknowledge it directly, and he had learned, after many years, which things to push on and which to leave alone. The doctor in Laramie had said what doctors say when they are being careful and honest at the same time, that she was 71 years old and her heart was working harder than it should, and that rest was advisable. Margaret had received this information with a nod and then asked 2 specific questions about which activities were most contraindicated, and the doctor had told her, and she had mentally filed the list and reduced those specific activities by approximately half, which was her version of compliance. Elias didn't sleep well anymore. He was aware of this as a new fact about himself. The way you become aware of things, the body changes without asking permission. He would wake at 3 or 4 in the morning and lie in the dark listening to Margaret breathe beside him. They had stopped pretending, some years back, that the arrangement between them required separate sleeping quarters, an acknowledgement that had been made without announcement and accepted by the children with varying degrees of comment. Clara with one raised eyebrow that she lowered immediately, Samuel with no visible reaction at all, Peter with the equanimity of a person who had always understood adults to be complicated and had stopped expecting otherwise. He would lie awake and listen to her breathe and think about all the improbable things that had to happen for this to be where he ended up. And the list was long and specific and slightly absurd, and he would not have traded any of it. The family gathered that weekend in the way that families gather, with noise and a certain productive chaos, children running through the house that had been built for 2 people and was now badly underdimensioned for the number of people trying to occupy it simultaneously. Ruth's 4-year-old and Clara's 3 boys achieving a collective volume that was impressive for their size. Clara's husband Marcus had the particular shell-shocked expression of a man who loves his children and also, periodically, cannot quite believe the decibel level they're capable of. Margaret sat in the chair by the kitchen window. Her chair, the one that got the morning light, the one where she'd done her accounts for 30 years, and watched all of it with an expression that Elias had never seen on her face in the early years, and that had emerged gradually over the course of the good ones. It was not quite contentment, because contentment implied passivity, and she had never been passive about anything. It was more like satisfaction, the deep, considered satisfaction of someone who had built a thing and was watching it work. She called Elias over in the mid-afternoon when the children were outside, and Samuel and Marcus had gone to look at the horses, and Clara was in the kitchen doing what Clara always did in any kitchen, which was assess its organizational logic and begin quietly improving it. "Sit down," Margaret said. He sat in the chair across from her, the chair that had always been his. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across her hands folded in her lap, and he noticed, as he sometimes did, the way those hands recorded everything. The cold winters, the fence work, the well digging, all the years of the ranch's physical demands written into the skin and knuckles. "I want to talk about the property," she said. "All right," he said. "Not the legal structure. Clara has that in hand." She looked at him with that direct assessing quality that had not changed in 30 years, that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her, and that was still entirely itself. "I want to talk about what we want to happen to it. We've talked about it before. I want to talk about it again. I want to make sure we've said it clearly." She paused. "Samuel should have the South Fields and the breeding operation. That's what he's built his life around, and he understands it the way a person only understands something they've given years to." "I agree," Elias said. "Peter keeps his house in the east section. The horses know him. That shouldn't be disrupted." "Yes. Clara doesn't need land. She'd tell us that herself. But I want her to have something." Margaret looked at the window. "The apple tree at the south end." Elias was quiet for a moment. "The one you said was an indicator for frost." "Thomas planted it our first year here. Clara doesn't know that story. I want to tell it to her, and then I want her to have it." She looked back at him. "Ridiculous to leave someone a tree in a will." "It's not ridiculous," he said. "It's a little ridiculous," she said, "but I'm going to do it anyway." He almost smiled. "You usually do what you're going to do anyway." "I usually know what's right," she said. Not arrogant, just accurate. They sat in the afternoon light for a while. Outside, the sound of the children and the horses and the particular busy quality of the ranch at full operation came through the window, and under it the creek, which had been running well for years now, did its steady, indifferent work along the south boundary. "I'm not afraid of it," Margaret said. He knew what she meant without her saying it more precisely. He had known, for months now, the shape of the conversation they were moving toward, and he hadn't rushed it, and she hadn't rushed it, and now here it was. "I know you're not," he said. "I was afraid of a lot of things when you arrived," she said. "I didn't show it." "You showed some of it," he said. "The parts you couldn't hide." "Which parts?" "You were afraid the ranch was going to fail," he said. "You were afraid of needing help. You were afraid of—" He thought about how to say it. Of letting anything matter too much again after Thomas, because mattering too much meant it could be taken. She looked at him with the expression she'd had on that first night in the barn, the one he'd spent years trying to name, that particular combination of clear-eyed recognition and something kept carefully back. "When did you figure that out?" she said. "First winter," he said. "Maybe second." "You didn't say anything." "It wasn't mine to say anything about," he said. "You'd get there yourself or you wouldn't." And if I hadn't? He thought about it honestly. Then I probably would have said something badly, and we would have had a significant argument. The corner of her mouth moved. We had those anyway. We did, he said. We're not easy people. No, she said. We're not. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence they'd built over decades, the kind that didn't need to be filled. I'm glad I was here, Elias said. I want you to know that clearly, not managing or saying it the right way. Just, I'm glad. She looked at him with those dark eyes that were the same as they'd always been. The years had moved around them, but hadn't changed them. Still that particular quality of seeing things as they actually were, rather than as you hoped they were. That fence post, she said. What? The one I was trying to reset when you rode up. She looked at the window. I'd been at it for an hour. I couldn't get the angle right. I was furious and exhausted, and I would not have asked anyone for help, which you probably understood immediately. Roughly, he said. And you just stopped. She shook her head slightly, as if the improbability of it still struck her. You didn't ask if I needed help. You just stopped and made an offer that wasn't charity, which was the only kind of offer I could have accepted. She looked at him. How did you know to do it that way? He thought about it. I didn't know, he said. I just looked at you and thought, that woman doesn't want to be rescued. She wants someone to work next to her. That's exactly what I wanted, she said. That's all I ever wanted. He held her gaze. I know, he said. I figured it out eventually. You figured out most things eventually, she said. You were slow sometimes. You were difficult sometimes. I was difficult most of the time, she said, with a precision that was also somewhere inside it a kind of pride. Yes, he said. You were. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand on his. Her hands were cold, which they'd been more often lately, and he covered them with both of his the way he'd learned to do. The day you stopped at that fence, she said quietly, was the day my real life started. I've thought about how to say that for a long time. That's the only way I know to say it. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at her hands inside his and thought about 30 years of mornings and the well and the drought and Venture being born and Peter's first words returning like a rusty hinge finding its motion and Clara arguing about freight and Samuel's short, tight nod that meant he'd accepted something important. Mine too, he said, if we're being exact about it. She squeezed his hands once, which was as much as she ever did in the way of gestures. And then she looked out the window at her ranch and her family making their noise in the yard, and she let herself simply watch it for a while. Margaret Holloway died on a Thursday morning in November, in her own bed, with the window cracked, the way she always slept with it cracked regardless of weather, the cold air coming in off the foothills that she'd breathed her whole life on this land. She went quietly, without drama, in the way of a person who had never wasted anything, and saw no reason to waste this either. Elias was beside her. He had been beside her all night, in the way you are when you understand that a thing is close without being told directly. He had held her hand through the dark hours, and she had mostly slept, and the last time she opened her eyes she looked at him with a clarity that surprised him after the haze of recent days, sharp and present, and entirely herself. "The north fence," she said. Her voice was thin. "The post at the corner. It's been leaning since August." He almost laughed. He almost completely laughed, and he held it together by an act of will that was one of the harder things he'd done in a life that had not been short on hard things. "I'll fix it," he said. "Today," she said. "Today," he said. She closed her eyes, and a little while later, between one breath and the next, she was simply gone, the way the best things end, without announcement, leaving behind only the space they used to fill. He sat with her for a while. He didn't rush. The children, all three of them, because they had all felt the same thing and had all arrived the night before without entirely knowing why, were in the house, and he could hear them being quiet in the kitchen in the particular way of people who are waiting for something they don't want to receive. Eventually, he went out to them, and he stood in the kitchen doorway, and he looked at the three faces looking back at him. Samuel, 30 years old, and still with that watchful quality, Clara with her accounts ledger set aside for once, and her hands in her lap, Peter with his dark eyes, that had always done most of his communicating for him. He told them. Samuel nodded once and looked at the table and was quiet for a long time. Clara put her face in her hands and cried in that sudden, flooding way, the same as she'd cried at the kitchen table the day Margaret had laid out the guardianship papers. Grief and gratitude tangled together in a way that couldn't be separated, and maybe shouldn't be. Peter didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, to no one in particular, "She fixed everything she said she'd fix, and she didn't fix anything she said she wouldn't." A silence. "Yes," Elias said, "that's true." "She was like that," Peter said. Not past tense as grief, past tense as fact. The steady acknowledgement of who she had been, which didn't require adjustment because the truth of a person doesn't change with their leaving. That afternoon, Elias went out to the north fence. The post at the corner was leaning, had been since August, just as she'd said. He dug it out and reset it with the methodical attention he'd given to fence posts for 30 years, tamping the soil around the base, checking the angle, running his hand down the wire to feel for tension. Samuel found him there an hour later and stood watching him work. "You didn't have to do that today," Samuel said. "I told her I would," Elias said. Samuel was quiet. Then he picked up the spare post driver that Elias had brought and moved to the next section of fence that needed checking, and they worked down the line together without speaking, the way they'd worked 100 times before. That was the funeral, in a way, for both of them. The north fence on a cold November afternoon, two men who had loved the same woman in different ways, doing the thing she would have wanted done. Elias lived 7 more months. He didn't get sick exactly, or he did, but not from anything the doctor could specifically name. He simply slowed, the way he'd watched Margaret slow, the way the creek slowed in late summer. He kept working. He wasn't going to stop working. He fixed the north fence and then the east gate, and then built a new hay storage structure on the south field that Samuel had been wanting for 2 years. And he did all of it more slowly than he would have once, and stopped to rest more often than felt comfortable. And the children watched him without saying what they were thinking. He told Clara one evening in May about Illinois, about the years before Wyoming, the wife who'd left, the decades of roads and ranches, and the particular freedom of having no permanent place that had felt, for a long time, like the right way to be. "Did you ever regret it?" Clara asked. "All those years of moving?" He thought about it honestly. "I regret some of the things I left," he said. "I don't regret the years themselves. They made me someone who could stop when stopping was the right thing." She looked at him with her mother's directness. "Do you think you would have stopped for someone else if it hadn't been her?" "No," he said without hesitation. Clara nodded slowly. "She wouldn't have let just anyone stay," she said. "She was particular. She was the most particular person I ever met," he said. "You were patient with it." "I was patient with it because it was worth being patient with," he said. "That's the only reason patience works, when the thing is actually worth it." He died on a June morning, in the same bed, with the same window cracked. Samuel found him at first light when Elias didn't come out to see to the horses, which he had done every morning for 30 years without exception, and Samuel understood before he opened the door what he was going to find. He was peaceful. That was the word Samuel used later, and it was true. Elias had the look of a man who had finished something properly, who had not left anything undone that needed doing, who had gotten to where he was going and found it was the right place. They buried them on the property, on a small rise at the east end that looked over the whole ranch, the fields and the paddocks, and the old apple tree at the south end, and the creek and its course along the boundary. Peter had found the spot. Of course he had. The ranch continued. That is the part of the story that doesn't get told often enough. Not the ending, but the continuing. Samuel ran the breeding operation with the knowledge that had passed to him through years of working beside 2 people who understood horses and land, and the long, patient relationship between them. Clara managed the accounts from Denver and came 4 times a year and argued with Samuel about expenses with the same precision she'd brought to freight negotiations at 15. Peter managed the day-to-day with Alice, who had married him the previous spring, and whose quietness complemented his own in the way that some people's qualities fit together like the 2 sides of a thing that was meant to be whole. The children they'd taken in raised children of their own who learned the same things, not as lessons, not as speeches given at dinner tables, but as the accumulated evidence of people they'd watched live. They learned that work done carefully was the only work that held, that a thing worth having was worth the patience it required. That fear of loss was real and reasonable and couldn't be allowed to stop you from building because everything that mattered was built under the possibility of loss. They learned that two people who were not easy, who carried their own damage and their own scar tissue and their own bad habits, could nevertheless build something together that outlasted them both. Not by being perfect, not by being lucky exactly, though luck was involved, but by choosing every day to stay. To show up to the fence line and the kitchen table and the hard conversations and the cold early mornings and all the specific ordinary demands of a life shared with another person. The horses bred and foaled and were sold and bred again. The creek ran. The north fence held. The apple tree that Thomas Holloway had planted in the first year of his marriage bloomed every April with the particular determination of something that has found its soil and intends to stay in it. And Claire's children and Peter's children and Samuel's children played beneath it on summer afternoons and didn't know the story of it yet, but they would. Clara would tell them, because Clara told them everything in the end, and she would tell it the way her mother had told her everything important, which was plainly and without decoration, and with the expectation that they were old enough to hear the truth. There is a certain kind of life that doesn't look like much from the outside. No battles won in a public sense, no monuments, no recorded history. Just land worked well, animals cared for, children raised into people who knew how to be decent and how to endure. Two people who found each other too late and too cautiously and built something anyway out of stubbornness and mutual respect, and whatever the thing is that grows between two people who keep showing up for each other past the point where it would have been easier not to. The lonely drifter who stopped at a broken fence found out, in the end, that what he'd been moving toward all those years on the road was not a place exactly, but a way of being in a place. Present, accountable, rooted in something real. He just needed someone worth stopping for, and she was standing right there in the mud with her cold red hands and her set jaw and her refusal to ask for help from anyone, not knowing that the help she needed was about to stop on its own. Some things happen the hard way. Most things worth having do.